morning cup of coffee has always been just a simple habit. The soft whirring of the coffee machine, the gentle aroma rising from a warm mug. It's the moment that kickstarts the day for tens of millions of Americans. But starting August 1st, 2025, that peaceful ritual suddenly vanished. A new executive order from the White House turned that familiar flavor into a global political story. The Donald Trump administration announced a 50% tariff on coffee imports from Brazil, the country often dubbed the coffee basket of the world. From that moment on, what once symbolized connection and culture was thrust into a new role, a weapon in the trade war. Americans used to see coffee as a kind of soft energy to start their day, but now each shimmering black drop in the cup feels more like ammunition in a standoff. Morning news no longer talks only about the taste of Arabica or Robusta beans. They focus on that 50% figure, a tariff that could reshape a supply chain worth hundreds of billions of dollars. From Starbucks to Dunkin to the little cafés tucked into street corners, all are trembling under this new wave. Coffee is no longer just coffee, it has become a symbol of power and the scramble for influence. So why does a single trade decision carry such massive shockwaves? Because Brazilian coffee isn't just another commodity, it's the foundation of the entire US coffee market. Behind every cappuccino in New York or every latte in California are sacks of Arabica beans grown on Brazil's vast plantations. And when that supply chain is disrupted, the question isn't just who's going to lose money, but who's going to pay the price first. And that's exactly where we need to go next, to understand why Brazilian coffee has become such a critical factor, powerful enough to shake routines, rattle the economy, and even stir the political ground of a global superpower. If there's one thing America can't live without, it's coffee. Americans consume over 24.5 million bags of coffee every year, and a staggering 22 million of those are imported. That alone shows just how deeply the world's largest coffee consumer relies on external sources. And among all those sources, Brazil plays a pivotal role. Nearly 1/3 of all the coffee in America comes from the sun-drenched highlands of South America. In other words, for every 3 cups of coffee an American holds in their hand, one likely carries the imprint of Brazil. But those aren't just dry statistics. They tell the story of Brazilian Arabica beans, the foundation of an entire global beverage industry. These beans are cheaper than many other sources, offer year-round stable yields, and boast a smooth, mild flavor that makes them perfect for blending into the signature formulas of Starbucks, Dunkin, Maxwell House, Tim Hortons pack, or those bulk-packed boxes lining the shelves at Costco. From the bustling cafes of New York to modest kitchens in Ohio, Brazilian Arabica beans have quietly woven themselves into the daily rhythm of tens of millions of lives. That's why Brazil's coffee supply chain is essentially the lifeblood of America's coffee culture. Even a temporary disruption can cause severe, unpredictable ripples. Starbucks might manage by raising prices. Premium brands could switch to more expensive beans from Ethiopia or Colombia. But for millions of working-class Americans, and for small, local cafe owners whose business depends on familiar flavors and affordable prices, the reality is far more brutal. Cut back, compromise, or close down. So the question grows more urgent. If that supply chain breaks, who pays the price first? The Brazilian farmers who've long relied on the US market? The global coffee brands built on cheap Arabica? Or ordinary American families who can't start their workday without a hot cup of coffee? The answer came faster than many expected. On August 1st, 2025, Washington delivered a seismic blow, a 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee, a move the Trump administration called protecting American farmers. But in truth, it sent shockwaves through the entire coffee world, turning a simple daily habit into a global political upheaval. On August 1st, 2025, America jolted awake as if struck by lightning. Washington officially announced a 50% tariff on imported coffee from Brazil, a decision that was both shocking and baffling. After all, everyone knows the US doesn't have a coffee industry capable of sustaining its massive domestic demand. All it really has are a few small plantations in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and some scattered experimental farms in California. In other words, the slogan, "Protect American Farmers," sounded bold, but in reality, it was more like a political smokescreen for a risky strategic move. On the very first night after the announcement, nearly 50 ships carrying Brazilian coffee bound for U.S. ports were forced to turn around. Containers packed with Arabica beans couldn't be unloaded, stranded at sea like hostages in a trade war. The images were broadcast live on multiple news networks, empty docks, massive ships rocking offshore, and the stunned faces of American importers who couldn't believe that the morning coffee of millions had now become a matter of national security. What was supposed to be a political win aimed at winning over domestic voters quickly spiraled into a full-blown geopolitical shock. Coffee associations, restaurant chains, and even banks all voiced deep concerns. Analysis segments flooded European and Asian media asking, is the US really making a smart move or tightening the noose around its own economy? Because once Brazil's coffee supply is cut off, that gap won't be easy to fill with the limited output of Central America or Africa. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Brazil's reaction was anything but panicked. Instead of scrambling, the government in Brasilia responded with a firm statement: we will not back down. And within just a few short days, Brazil began to pivot, opening up new doors that it had previously overlooked. From what seemed like a moment of defeat, Brazil turned crisis into opportunity, creating a surprising turning point in the global game. Brazil's response came so swiftly it left the world stunned. Just moments after the White House announced the tariffs, the president of Brazil appeared on national television, calm but resolute. We do not bow to pressure. Instead of seeking compromise with Washington, Brasilia immediately laid out a new course: expand the market, diversify its buyers, and prove that no one holds a monopoly over the agricultural black gold known as Brazilian coffee. Within just 3 days, China fast-tracked licenses for over 200 Brazilian companies to import coffee directly, positioning Beijing as a promising replacement for the void left by the US. Images flooded the media. Warehouses in Shanghai and Guangzhou, packed with freshly arrived containers of coffee, welcomed like a new source of energy in a market increasingly addicted to the flavor. In Europe, major coffee corporations rushed to sign long-term contracts with Brazil, seizing the moment as a golden chance to break free from more unstable sources. Japan and South Korea also joined the wave, opening their markets to millions of coffee bags, quickly capitalizing on the breakdown between two economic giants. Ironically, the tariff meant to force Brazil into submission instead gave the South American nation a path out of America's shadow. Rather than clinging to a powerful but unpredictable customer, Brazil now confidently positioned itself as a strategic supplier to multiple global economies at once. Every new contract signed, every container leaving the port of Santos headed eastward, wasn't just a business transaction, it was a declaration. Brazil is strong enough to weather any political storm. But as Brazil found opportunity across the ocean, the United States began to face the immediate consequences. With no more Brazilian containers flooding its ports, the American coffee market quickly slipped into shortage. And as supply failed to meet demand, Americans, from household name chains to mom-and-pop street cafes, were forced to face a hard truth: that familiar morning cup of coffee was no longer as cheap or as easy to come by as it once was. In the early days of August 2025, Americans began to feel a distinct shift in every sip of their morning coffee. At major supermarkets across New York, retail coffee prices surged by 15 to 20% in just a matter of weeks. From an average of $7 per pound, many familiar brands were forced to raise prices to $8, even $9. For middle-income families, that meant a simple daily habit had suddenly become a budget consideration. More people started buying whole beans to brew at home, skipping their usual stops at neighborhood cafes. And in that atmosphere, a cup of coffee, once synonymous with comfort, now carried with it the weight of careful financial calculation. Small, independent cafes, heavily reliant on affordable Brazilian Arabica, were hit the hardest. With import costs spiking by 30 to 40%, many shop owners had no choice but to raise prices or cut back on bean quality. But for customers accustomed to the smooth, mellow flavor of Brazilian coffee, even the slightest change was reason enough to walk away. The result, a wave of layoffs and, in some cases, full closures. Quiet corners once filled with conversation and community slowly fell silent. And it wasn't just consumers or small shops, even the big names found themselves backed into a corner. Starbucks, the global coffee icon, had to adjust prices across major cities, while Dunkin slashed promotions to cover mounting losses. These corporate giants, once thought immune due to their scale, now faced an angry customer base, people who no longer felt that coffee for everyone was an affordable promise. A cultural symbol, where coffee meant convenience and social connection, was suddenly shaken, all because of a single tariff policy. Meanwhile, images of Americans standing in long lines at supermarkets to buy overpriced coffee began circulating in international media, sparking ridicule. The world watched and saw the irony clearly: a superpower in tech, energy, and finance, brought to its knees by a humble agricultural product. The soaring price of a cup of coffee exposed more than just a supply chain vulnerability. It raised a deeper question about the true cost of using tariffs as a political weapon. And yet, as the US spiraled into a coffee crisis just north of the border, another country quietly chose a very different path. And it was that very silence that turned Canada into the quiet beneficiary of the global coffee war. While the US reeled from a coffee price storm, Canada quietly took a very different path. Ottawa stayed silent amid Washington's loud moves. No tariffs, no grandstanding statements. Instead, it quietly maintained normal trade relations with Brazil. The result? Within just 1 year, Canadian imports of Brazilian coffee rose by 7% in 2024 and continued to climb sharply throughout 2025. While Americans struggled with soaring prices and dwindling supplies, Canadians kept enjoying their morning cups at stable prices. Tim Hortons, the beloved national coffee brand of Canada, became the clearest symbol of that difference. In cities like Toronto and Vancouver, the price of a cup of coffee remained unchanged, and the public barely felt the storm raging just across the border. In contrast, Starbucks in the US was forced to hike prices repeatedly, creating a bitter comparison. Just one border apart, yet the daily coffee experience and the cost were worlds apart. Ironically, many Americans began ordering coffee online from Canada, seeing it as a temporary lifeline for their wallets. For Brazil, Canada suddenly became its new golden customer. Ottawa's loyalty and stability led Brasilia to see Canada not just as a buyer, but as a strategic partner for expanding its North American footprint. Every new contract signed with Canadian companies felt like a quiet slap to Washington. The same Arabica beans, no longer docking in New York, now safely anchored in Montreal or Halifax. In this grand trade chessboard, Canada, once a modest player, had quietly risen to become a surprising beneficiary. And as Canadians peacefully sipped Brazilian coffee, while Americans paid the price and Brazil extended its influence, the global picture began to shift. Coffee was no longer just a story between a few countries. It had become a vital link in a much larger geopolitical game. And from this point on, the world began to understand even the smallest tremor in the coffee industry could send shockwaves rippling across the globe. The aftershocks of America's tariff decision didn't stop at the North American border. They quickly rippled across the globe. Within just a few weeks, the price of Arabica coffee on the world market skyrocketed by 30%, while Robusta, once seen as a cheaper alternative, surged by an astonishing 50%. Roasters in Europe and Asia scrambled to secure alternative sources, throwing the global coffee market into a whirlwind of uncertainty. Other producing nations like Vietnam, Colombia, and Ethiopia suddenly found themselves in the spotlight, flooded with urgent new orders, a golden opportunity to expand their market share. But that boom came with a cloud of anxiety. If Washington continued using tariffs as a weapon, who might be the next target? Coffee is not like corn, wheat, or oil. It's not a commodity that can be ramped up in a matter of months. A coffee tree takes years to bear fruit, and its yield depends heavily on climate and soil conditions. That's why America's shock move didn't just spike prices, it threatened to create a long-term imbalance as rising demand ran headfirst into a supply that simply couldn't keep up. Experts warned that if tensions dragged on, the world could face a cascading crisis: supply shortages, price volatility, and fractures in global trade relationships. In many developing countries, where coffee isn't just an export, but the livelihood of millions of farming families, these price fluctuations cut both ways. In the short term, higher prices mean bigger paychecks. But over time, instability leaves farmers dangerously exposed, caught in a financial storm if the US continues to roll out unpredictable protectionist policies. Coffee, once a familiar crop, now resembles a small but weighty chess piece on the global board, where every move by a superpower can alter the entire landscape. And then looking back, the irony becomes clear. A tiny bean, once simply a way to start the day, had the power to jolt the entire world economy. Coffee is no longer just the taste of alertness, it has become a measure of power, a symbol of how fragile and entangled our supply chains have become in this era of globalization. A morning cup of coffee, small, simple, seemingly ordinary, has the power to reflect the tremors of global upheaval. America's decision to slap a 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee laid bare two brutal truths: the immense strength and shocking fragility of the world's supply chains, and the unpredictable cost when tariffs are weaponized for political gain. On this chessboard, the winner isn't always the strongest, but the one who adapts the fastest. Brazil, once thought cornered, seized the opportunity to expand its markets and diversify its customer base. Canada, with its quiet restraint, became the silent beneficiary, strengthening its foothold in North America. And China, with rapid pivoting, muscled its way into the global coffee trade. On the other hand, the real losers were the most ordinary people. American farmers didn't even have a domestic coffee industry to protect, yet were used as the justification for a trade-off. Small cafés shut their doors, thousands of workers lost their jobs, and millions of American families were forced to spend hundreds of extra dollars just to hold on to a simple morning ritual. Coffee, once a symbol of warmth and conversation, became an emblem of instability, a reminder of the high cost of a political move. Behind a single cup of coffee, one thing becomes clear. In today's world, nothing exists outside of politics. From a kernel of corn to a bar of steel, even a humble coffee bean, everything can become a pawn in global power plays. And when those shocks ripple through the system, it's not the politicians in boardrooms who feel it first, but regular people with regular lives and regular routines. If you have thoughts or perspectives on this coffee story, drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future breakdowns of the small pieces that are shaping the world. Because sometimes just one cup of coffee is enough to tell the story of power and of our times.